My pleasure to introduce Andrew Tink, our speaker this evening. He's going to talk about his most recent book and a little bit about being an author. He's published a whole series. I think this is the 5th book since he retired from politics. And he was introduced to me by a mutual friend and agreed to talk with us tonight. Thank you, Andrew.
This is a pretty formidable audience because you all know a hell of a lot more about radios than I do. Even Roger Stiles up there, my old friend from Bob and Head days. I could never work a marine radio, but Roger showed me the way. This latest book I've written is called Honeysuckle Creek. It's the name of a place. It's right up in the high country, about 30 miles south of Canberra. It was virgin bushland until in the mid-1960s, NASA came looking for a site for an Apollo tracking station. Now, there was already a tracking station in that area, and it's still there. It's called Tidbinbilla. And Tidbinbilla is a deep space tracking station where man-made objects, these days way out beyond the solar system, can still be tracked by Tidbinbilla, and signals can be sent and received and all that sort of thing. There was for a while a third tracking station out behind Canberra at a place called Auroral Valley, and these 3 tracking stations were different. So Tidbinbilla was deep space, is deep space I should say. Auroral Valley specialised in satellites that orbited the Earth, some in very fast, close-in orbits, others in orbits that went right out on the other side of the moon and back, but essentially orbits around the Earth to a greater or lesser degree. They were very intense, the workings at Auroral Valley. Can I talk without this? Oh, I can talk pretty loudly, you know. This thing's bouncing back a bit.
Yeah, it's turned on.
I like it. So I'll just talk loudly instead, if you can hear me. So, Auroral Valley, they would typically be tracking a number of satellites at the same time, and a number of them would come over the horizon incredibly fast. And so it was all about a very short view period. It was about having all the equipment set up so that they could be picked up virtually instantaneously and then tracked for about 7 or 8 minutes until they passed back over the horizon. Auroral is now closed because, and I don't know much about this, but I gather you can do a lot of that sort of tracking from space. So they have satellites that actually track other satellites in Earth orbit, and so the idea of a ground tracking station for that purpose has become redundant. And then the third type of tracking station, which is what my book's all about, is an Apollo tracking station. And they were specially built, and there are only 3 of them. One at Honeysuckle Creek, one outside Madrid in Spain called Fresno Dallas, and one at Goldstone in California, which is just near Barstow in the desert. Now, these 3 tracking stations were approximately 120 degrees apart from each other, and that was deliberately chosen because the situation that the Apollo planners faced was a moon, which of course was the target, which to all practical intents and purposes over the period of an Apollo mission would be relatively static in space with its near side facing the Earth. But of course the Earth spins once every 24 hours, and so if you want to keep in touch with people on or near the moon, with the Earth spinning once every 24 hours, you need 3 space tracking stations placed roughly equally distantly around the globe, each of which, once an Apollo spacecraft gets out beyond about 10,000 miles from Earth, each of those stations could have what they call the view period for about 8 hours each. There was some overlap. Sometimes 2 stations could maintain contact at the same time for a short period. But that was the basic sort of setup that was required. And NASA had decided fairly early in the piece that it was very important to maximise the astronauts' chances of survival. The Soviet Union, because of course in those days they were the Soviet Union, they weren't the Russians. The Soviet Union didn't have the same issues. It was a totalitarian dictatorship basically, and when the Russian leaders wanted money, they got money, and nobody asked any questions. So Yuri Gagarin got sent up into space as a totally unknown person. He was not known to the public at that time. And it wasn't until he was up sort of safely in space that they started telling the world his name and all the rest of it once they realised they had a fair chance of getting him down. The United States was completely different. It's of course a democracy, and money comes through Congress. And getting congressional support and continuing congressional support to fund the space missions was absolutely fundamental. So the original 7 American astronauts were major public figures before they ever went into space. They were lionised in Life magazine. There are some legendary publications in Life magazine which profiled each of these astronauts as God-fearing family men. And so being these huge public figures, NASA had a huge premium on making sure that if something went wrong, and in the original Mercury program, NASA expected to lose a couple of astronauts. I think I'm right in saying they didn't, not then. It was very important to be able to show the Congress and the American public that everything had been done that could reasonably be done to save these men and keep them safe. So the Americans had this space tracking network, and the Russians, as far as I know, had nothing like it. They used to, fire off people into space and all the rest of it with much more rudimentary communication systems, and that's because essentially they could. What it meant though was that as time went by, well, the Russians got ahead early, we know that. Sputnik went up, scared the daylights out of the Americans. The Russians had a lot of fun with it. The American space tracking stations at that stage, which were being set up for their first missions, I think they were at you guys would know more than me, but I think it was 108 megahertz or something like that. They were all set up for that. So the Russians deliberately had a totally different setup. And then TASS, once Sputnik was up and safely in orbit, TASS made it known to amateur radio operators around the world that it could be listened to on this other frequency. And so all these amateur radio people, no doubt a lot in Australia, were listening to Sputnik beeping away, while NASA was tearing, it wasn't NASA then, the American space people were tearing around trying to send special systems to their tracking stations so they could actually pick up the signal. So Russia made a big leap in the beginning, and that of course was followed up most famously by Yuri Gagarin, who wasn't only the first person into space, but in the same mission the first person to orbit the Earth. The Americans sent up basically a remote controlled mechanical astronaut, so to speak, who displayed all the characteristics of an astronaut as far as they could program a machine in those days. That was the first thing that happened. All tracked from Woomera, by the way, where the guy I write about was tracking stuff back then. We're talking, 1960, 61. Then sent up a chimpanzee called Enos, and sent up Alan Shepard as the first American into space, and his was a suborbital flight. He sort of went up and down. And then, only after all that, they sent up John Glenn for an orbital flight, also tracked from Woomera. Now for the orbital flights, what the Americans had were a whole series of space tracking stations placed around the globe, bearing in mind that any one station could only be in view of a low Earth orbiting satellite for about 7 or 8 minutes at most. There are about 18 or 19 of these stations. A couple of them were ships actually in the ocean, and they didn't have complete coverage, but the coverage was pretty good. And they had a rudimentary team of 3 at each of these stations, a Capcom, a capsule communicator, short for a capsule communicator, a surgeon who would, listen to the vital signs being, sent down by telemetry, and also, Glenn talked and explained how he felt and all this sort of thing, and a technical guide, an engineer sort of thing. So the original team at each of these stations was 3 people. Now, as things developed, all these capabilities were centralised at ultimately Mission Control in Houston, and Mission Control became this massive exercise in supporting Apollo missions. They had the main Mission Control room where there was a person in charge of each of the principal sort of components in an Apollo program, including a surgeon, guidance guy, Guido, retro firing rocket guy, retro, there's a whole bunch of them, and the flight director. And then they had about 3 or 4 of these teams, and they'd be switched over to different parts of the mission. And then in rooms behind the Mission Control room, or a lot of other rooms, they had all these backup guys for each of these key specialists that was in the Mission Control room. It was just massive. And then, of course, you had the astronauts. I'll just go straight to Apollo missions. You had the astronauts either going to the moon or coming back from the moon, or in orbit around the moon, or on the moon's surface. And so what the tracking stations did, and there were the 3 tracking stations that did this, they could both transmit and they could receive. They had transmitters and receivers, very powerful things. There was a big exclusion zone. You couldn't go anywhere near the dish when it was transmitting, a lot of radiation and so forth. They were the eyes and ears, really, of both Mission Control and the astronauts. So I sort of put it this way, a little bit simplistically. There'll be a lot of film about this over the next 6 months, where we've just passed Apollo 7, the 50th anniversary. We're about to roll into the 50th anniversary of Apollo 8, famously around Christmas Day, and then 9, 10 and 11 next year. And what you'll see all this footage, I have no doubt, of people at Mission Control talking to astronauts on the moon. The reality is that they would have been deaf, dumb and blind to each other, but for the 3 Apollo tracking stations. So the stations were basically the eyes and ears, they in terms of reception and transmission between the guys at Mission Control and the guys on the moon and in orbit around the moon. These 3 tracking stations had 85-foot diameter dishes, I think about 26 metres, something like that. They're a standard design, and this is important in relation to Parkes, which is at the same longitude roughly as Honeysuckle. The Apollo tracking dishes could be angled down to 0 degrees. They could be angled down to the horizon. The bigger dishes, the one at Parkes, I think it's 210 feet, same size as a really big one they've now got at Tidbinbilla and also at Golston. They could only be angled down to 30 degrees. They couldn't get down to 0 degrees. The dishes are just too damn big and heavy and one thing and another.
Not because they hit the ground, it's because they're just not strong enough, is it?
I understand it's just a structural function of just the size and weight of the dishes. They're thousands of tons apparently. So what this meant, NASA had a rule of thumb that for every 15 degrees was an extra hour until moonrise. So even though, the moon rises over Parkes, that's to say the town, at the same time roughly it rises over Canberra, the moon doesn't rise over the Parkes dish sufficient to get a broadcast quality signal until about 2 hours after the moon rises over the Honeysuckle Creek dish. And the way the moon landing played out for Apollo 11, it turned out to be quite critical. So I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself a bit, but what was transmitted up was voice. So there was now a capsule communicator at Mission Control, always an astronaut. And except in the case of an extreme emergency, the Capcom was the only person authorised to talk to an astronaut. You know, they were all in this tight little team together. They understood each other, and whatever they wanted at Mission Control, Gene Kranz was the most famous mission controller, a flamboyant guy, very, very good controller. But he did not talk to the astronauts. It all went via a Capcom who sat right beside him. And so the Capcom's voice would go up to the astronauts, and then the astronauts would talk back, and the two-way communication, travelling at somewhere near the speed of light, was not quite, but almost instantaneous. They could almost sort of carry on a conversation. I think it was 250,000 miles up and 250,000 miles back, give or take. A ranging code was also sent up by the tracking station to the two spacecraft when they were operating separately, the lunar lander and the command module, and then the signal was sent back, and in that way they could figure out at any one time just exactly where the command module and the lunar module were. And famously, you know, Armstrong was flying the lunar lander for Apollo 11, and the landing area which had been earmarked for Apollo 11, when Armstrong got close to it, he figured out it wasn't any good. There were boulders all over the place and one thing or other. So he kept flying the lunar module until the telemetry coming down was telling Armstrong that the lunar lander's fuel level was below where it could be measured. He was basically flying on the fumes. And when he landed, he famously said, well, I got no idea where we are. I'll let you guys work that out. And so that's how this ranging code is really very, very important. And the third thing that could be sent up was they could send up automatic command signals. Mission Control could send up automatic command signals to the spacecraft. And indeed, that's what Tidbinbilla does today. I mean, they send command signals to spacecraft that are right at the outer edge of the solar system and beyond. It takes hours and hours for the signals to get to the target.
20 hours to avoid your one.
So it's astonishing the distances, but they do it. So coming back down the other way was voice, and also critically telemetry, which is where the guy I write about really began his expertise. That was his expertise, telemetry, tracking things. And the telemetry that came down was the astronauts' heartbeats, their respiration rates, their temperatures, and a whole lot of other things. And in the on the technical side, all sorts of readouts, every conceivable thing with the spacecraft and the lunar module. Just a little bit on Tom Reid, if I can. Well, first of all, I knew him very well. I was at the ANU Law School in the early 1970s, and I dated a girl called Reid, and we were very close for about 3 years until we had a terrible bust-up, which was all my fault. But I knew Tom very well, and he was a very self-effacing guy. He never really spoke about what he did. And I had a vague inkling that what he did was important, because there was a certificate in their living room that I saw, which was signed by the NASA bigwigs exactly 12 weeks to the day after Armstrong had stepped onto the moon American time. And it was clear from this that Tom had played a critical role. So years later, when I saw The Dish, my first thought was, the film The Dish that is, and my first thought was, I saw Sam Neill walking towards the Parks Dish, and I thought, wrong place, wrong person. And this just rankled with me, you know. And then I started to catch up with the Reids, I suppose about 10 years ago. Tom was dead by this time. And I said, you know, to one of them, why didn't Tom say something about this? And they said, well, you know what he's like, he just didn't want to get involved. And there the matter rested. And then started to look at it a little bit more and started to realise that there was a big story in this. And I just, you know, thought that it was important to correct a record. So what part of the record needed correcting? Well, Parkes did play a big role in the Apollo 11 TV. It had a dish that was much bigger than Honeysuckle's, and once the moon had risen over the Parkes dish, it took over the TV telecast and it did it well. But at the time that Armstrong stepped onto the moon, it was 12:56 p.m. On the 21st of July in Australia, 20th of July in the United States. And at 12:56 p.m. the moon had not risen over the Parkes dish, and Parkes could not therefore get a broadcast quality signal to the satisfaction of NASA. What this meant was that at the critical time, and by the way, Armstrong and Aldrin were supposed to come out and do their little walk and everything at 4 p.m. on the 21st of July, but they managed to talk NASA or Mission Control into letting them come out some hours early. They said, we don't want to have a rest period, we want to get on with this. Well, NASA let them do it, but it created consternation at the tracking stations. The Apollo 11 flight plan was about the size of a Sydney telephone directory in the old days. And of course, most of this stuff was thrown out the window, and the telex machines went mad with all sorts of new calculations and all this sort of stuff, and they're trying to get across it. But what it meant was when Armstrong came out, and even though the time had been sort of advanced quite a lot, there was still a lot of doubt when it would all happen, because it took them much longer to suit up in the lunar lander than they'd originally anticipated. You know, the great big backpacks and helmets and all that sort of stuff they had to put on. It just took them a long while to get all that stuff on. And it needed to be right, because, you know, if you step out onto the moon without all that stuff being absolutely A-OK and correct, you die a horrible, horrible death. So it did take them some time. So there's this whole movable feast of timing, you see. To complicate things a little bit more, I'm sorry, I'm bouncing around a little bit. The televising of Armstrong stepping onto the moon was only something that was finally agreed upon very late in the piece, which is to say only a couple of weeks before Apollo 11 blasted off. There'd been a debate raging in NASA for the better part of a decade about whether or not televising the landing was an advisable thing to do or not. One group said, well, it's totally superfluous to the mission. It doesn't add anything to the astronaut's safety. In fact, it causes some problems, because with the lunar lander, where weight is at such a premium, you know, the weight of a TV camera could make all the difference, or all those sort of arguments. And the argument, on the other hand, was always the American argument. American taxpayers are paying for this. They've got a right to watch it on TV in real time. Now, as this debate raged, NASA decided, okay, what we'll do is we will commission the development of a special TV camera to do this, just in case we make the decision to allow the filming to go ahead. So a guy called Stan Lebar and a team of 75 from Westinghouse developed this amazing little TV camera. There's a photograph of it in the book here. The average weight of a TV camera in those days was about 400 pounds. This thing that Stan Lebar came up with was about 6 pounds.
Wow.
It could withstand, I think the temperature differences on the moon are almost something getting close to absolute zero, to something like about 300 degrees Fahrenheit or something, with the most amazing changes also in light and darkness. So this tiny little camera was just an amazing thing, and it derived some of its characteristics from a top secret tube that was used in Vietnam to find American pilots who were downed at night, that sort of thing. So it's a lot of this top secret. Well, anyway, about 3 or 4 weeks before Apollo 11 blasted off, a magnificently named guy called Christopher Columbus Kraft, who was the director of flight operations and the really big cheese at Mission Control, they didn't get any bigger than Chris Kraft, won the day, and you know, they decided to proceed with a televised first step. But what this meant was, of course, I mean, well, had sort of there been an ABC TV crew on the moon waiting for Armstrong to come down the ladder, that would have been news. But of course we know that wasn't going to happen. So they had to rig this thing up so it would operate automatically, you see. So it was set up in, well, the acronym is for it is a MESA, M-E-S-A. I can't remember the technical words, but basically it's a tool locker attached to the outside of the lunar lander, which when Armstrong activated a lanyard, this tool locker popped open, and then the camera was already positioned in it in such a way that it would face the ladder, you see, where Armstrong was going to come down. Weight constraints on the lunar module were so great that, those of you who've seen First Man know what I'm talking about. Armstrong and Aldrin flew the thing standing up. They were tethered by straps, but they didn't sit to fly the lunar lander. They actually were standing, flying it. And it was said that the external skin of this thing was so thin you could punch a pencil through it, which is another way of saying that, you know, weight was an absolute premium. So with this little camera, the only way they could fit it was to fit it so that when it popped out, it was upside down. Okay, so it was filming upside down. That was the only way they could do it. So the tracking stations were each fitted with a little switch. In those days, cost about 5 cents at a hardware store. This switch, but the switch turned the upside down picture right side up. You see. So 12:56 p.m. Parkes has not got a broadcast quality signal, and so its signal is not sent on to mission control. There's a guy in Sydney called Charlie Goodman who's pre-selecting the TV images being produced here at Honeysuckle, Parkes, blah blah blah. The Honeysuckle image from a smaller dish was sent off to Houston, and it was of broadcast quality. And when Armstrong pulled on the lanyard and the camera popped out and began automatically filming, the technician at Honeysuckle, a guy called Ed von Renoir, who'd been hand-selected by Tom Reid, Ed von Renoir was momentarily sort of taken aback by what he was seeing, but pretty quickly figured out what to do and got the reversing switch right. And so Honeysuckle's sending off a broadcast quality picture. At Goldston, where there was this much bigger dish, the technician mucked things up. And unfortunately, the poor fellow, you know, panicked. And pretty soon he didn't know which way to press the switch, which way to flick the switch. And for the first minute or so, when the TV images were being beamed around the world, 600 million people, the film was a mess. I mean, I was a schoolboy watching in the science auditorium at my school, and we couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. And then after a couple of minutes and mission control pleading with this guy at Goldston to get his act sorted out, and it wasn't happening, finally the fellow in charge of TV at Houston, a guy called Ed Tarkington, said about just under 2 minutes into this business, all stations were switching video to Honeysuckle. And it was about a minute or so after that that Armstrong stepped onto the moon and said, "One small step for a man." And so it was Honeysuckle which transmitted that image to the world, and it's only through Honeysuckle that 600 million people saw Armstrong stepping onto the moon. Now, to me, that's a pretty big deal. And in a way, it's kind of nice because when Honeysuckle was first set up, the Australian government had a policy, which was that there would be no disrespect, there would be no Americans at Honeysuckle. Now, Tom was a Glaswegian, but only Australian citizens or Australian residents, and he was an Australian resident, would be allowed to work at Honeysuckle. And their first director was a dud. Nice guy, intelligent guy, but he was a dud. He just couldn't do this job. And what happened was, before the first manned mission to the moon, the tracking stations in Canberra's case, in Honeysuckle Creek's case, they used to fly a big plane backwards and forwards over the Brindabella mountain, which to guys at the tracking station behind their machinery, it might as well have been an Apollo aircraft, Apollo spacecraft. Now, after a few of these simulations, the American in charge of simulations who came out here to test Honeysuckle called the whole crew into the canteen and basically said, after a 15-minute rundown of what they were doing wrong, you guys are a bunch of shit. And that's actually what he said. And then he said, okay, well, no one's leaving here until we do another couple of simulations. At which point the director of Honeysuckle, the then director, said, well, we've all been working very hard for a week and I'm sorry, I'm too tired and I'm not going to, you know, I'm just not going to push the team to do any more of this. And from that moment his card was marked. But by this stage in Apollo with NASA, the word no, and I can't do it, or I'm too tired, it just did not compute. And so they decided to get rid of him, and Tom Reid, who had been performing very well at some of these other tracking facilities that I mentioned before, was brought in to do the job and clean the station up. He was ruthless. He had a background in the Navy. He understood that technicians could often do a much better job than engineers with this sort of work. And he just put the cleaners through the joint, and within about 3 months, Honeysuckle had gone from the bottom of the pile of the 3 tracking stations to the top in terms of performance. So when it was all over, well, Tom didn't say anything, and it wasn't widely known in public that this is actually what had happened. And not until relatively recently that the tapes of what happened have been relocated. But the tape of Ed Tarkington saying all stations were switching video to Honeysuckle, the log of the timing against the tape and the transcripts of what was said are all now there for all to see. And the CSIRO, which now runs Tidbinbilla, and of course ran Parkes, and still runs Parkes I think, has conceded in the last year or so that indeed it was Honeysuckle that got the footage of Armstrong stepping onto the moon. So this is a story that I always wanted to tell, and that's really what this book's about. And Tom Reid, who was, you might say, a pretty snippy Glaswegian, and they don't come much snippier than snippy Glaswegians, he said famously on the 20th anniversary of this, because he didn't say much at all about it, his family didn't know. It was the 20th anniversary of the moon landing at the Lakeside Hotel, and he got up and spoke. I think he had a few scotches by then. And he said, I've got to get this right. It wasn't meant to be that way, but that's the way it was, and God damn it, we were ready. And that's the story of Tom Reid and Honeysuckle Creek. Thank you. Any questions?
Can I just ask a really stupid one? So Honeysuckle Creek is near Canberra, right?
Yes.
And so where's Galston?
Galston is in California.
In California, near Barstow.
And the third one is
near Madrid.
Fresnadillas, which is near Madrid. Now, there are still tracking stations because at each, in the sense that that's where the deep space tracking is done now. So the sort of principle, as I understand, the principle remains roughly the same. The primary determinant is the fact that the Earth spins once every 24 hours on its axis. So they're always going to need, well, current technology, they're going to need 3 space tracking stations, at least for the foreseeable future. And that's why they're located where they are. In the case of Honeysuckle, the Americans, a lot of the tracking was originally done at Woomera, which in terms of longitude would also do. In fact, in terms of longitude, it was probably a little bit better than Honeysuckle. The biggest gap is between Honeysuckle down here and Fresnadillas, which is way over there. That's the biggest gap. So closing it at least to Woomera to the west would be a good thing. Trouble with Woomera is people didn't like it.
It's a horrible place to live.
People would, you know, come out from England and so forth, you know, really smart people with their families, and they'd take a look out the window and decide to go home before the propellers had stopped spinning. So what after a lot of this, what NASA needed, what they wanted somewhere that had some industrial capacity, at least to put together things like dishes, right? And Canberra had, this is even in the 1960s, Canberra had still has an area called Fishwick where they could actually do that sort of stuff. They thought it was a good thing to have a good university nearby. In Canberra's case then, the Australian National University. And they also said, well, it needs to be a nice place for families. There's still raging debate about whether Canberra's nice for anything, but it's sure as a hell of a lot better than bloody Woomera.
Well, it needs to be radio quiet, and
that's the other thing. Radio, and that's the other thing. And I should say that Tidbinbilla is on the other side of, I think it's called the Bullen Range from Canberra, and the aircraft. Commercial aircraft don't actually fly over Tidbinbilla. There's probably an exclusion, I think.
All three of those valleys are on east-west, so they get to see the horizon.
Correct.
East and west both ways.
And Aurora was in another valley and another ridge, and then Honeysuckle was way up on a ridge. Honeysuckle was at the top of the dish was 3,800 feet above sea level. And what this meant was, of course, July 1969, midwinter, and for Apollo 10, which had been in May, I think it was, they actually got a dish full of snow, and they had to break track to dump the snow. Now, of course, in the States and in Madrid at that time, it's stinking hot, and a lot of the guys at NASA just thought somebody was pulling their leg when Canberra said we got to break track to dump the snow. The NASA guys obviously had been out to Australia, but they preferred to come in summer when they could have a surf. And that way, well, you wouldn't go up to Honeysuckle Creek in your right mind in winter. It's one of those places that's so cold. If you're not wearing gloves and you sort of put your hand on an iron railing, you lose skin.
Did you ever meet Robert Day?
Pardon me?
Robert, did you ever meet Robert Day? Robert was at Honeysuckle from Apollo 13 on. I worked with him through the late 90s and through 2000s.
The guys I
But the story, sorry, I was going to say the story about that was that was the radio that received Houston, we have a problem from Apollo.
Yeah.
He was standing behind that guy.
Well, they did a remarkable job. Tom had moved on to Tidbinbilla by that stage, and Tidbinbilla was the wing station. So when
the dish has been reinstalled at Tidbinbilla. I believe the Honeysuckle dish has been reinstalled at Tidbinbilla.
It's in Tasmania, isn't it? Aurora Valley.
The Aurora Valley dish is in Tasmania.
That's right.
The Honeysuckle dish was moved down to Tidbinbilla, and it remained in use until 2010. And now it's
There's a bunch of other antennas there in replacing it.
That's right. It's still there, but its dish is in a stowed position, so it's like that.
But there's only foundations if you go to Aurora and Honeysuckle and signs.
Yeah.
So you still go and visit. I visited a few years ago.
I think it's so. If you haven't been, it's a wonderful place to visit because they're beautiful places, and the foundations and stuff are still there. And it's remarkable what they did. I mean, at Honeysuckle, there was no power up there, so what they built were a bunch of massive generators, and then they had to truck up all the diesel. So there was no power line up there. And it was all on the American, it was all
50 hertz.
and all that sort of stuff. And the irony was that even though Honeysuckle transmitted to the world this footage of Armstrong stepping onto the moon, you couldn't actually get commercial TV reception up there.
Is that right?
So no,
They couldn't watch it.
They could only watch it. They could watch it on monitors. And there's a guy called Kevin Galegas, who's one of my great heroes. Actually, is in here. Another pick of Tom's. He was a Navy guy. He grew up in Toowoomba. He had no formal education beyond about year 10. Knockabout sort of guy, but very, very bright. Goes into the Navy, and he's just one of these guys who's an intuitive thinker, calm in a crisis, whip smart, get stuff done. And he ended up with the most critical job in Honeysuckle. And typical of the sort of hires that Tom made, not worried about whether or not you had a first class degree in electrical engineering. That didn't mean diddly squat to him. It was whether you could, handle the equipment, and he could. Kevin's still alive. Mike Dinn, who was Tom's deputy director for Apollo 11, he's still alive. John Saxon, the operations manager, who sat in what they call the Ops 2 seat for this critical period. Tom was in the Ops 1 seat. He's still alive. Brian Sullivan, a computer guy, still going. About 5 or 6 of them. And I tested their patience. I'm a lawyer politician and not very good at either. And, I try and understand this technical stuff enough to write about it. And I must have driven them mad, going back repeatedly, asking the same questions until I could figure out what they were talking about. They all talk very fast, they all talk in acronyms. Anyway.
We don't do that.
How did the video signal get out from Honeysuckle to the commission?
It got sent back to. It got sent back. Yes, there's a whole network, but it ultimately got back. I think via Goddard to Mission Control.
It had radio links out.
Yeah. And there were cable, there was microwave, there was all sorts of stuff, a whole bunch of stuff. This was really the first big international communication network of this sort of sophistication, and they had trouble with it. In various places, farmers, not knowing there was a critical NASA cable just below the surface, they dig the cable up with a backhoe and all this sort of stuff. And that happened a couple of times.
These days it'd be sold on eBay.
And that happened. I mean, up at Honeysuckle, they were using because the TV was so late, and Honeysuckle was only supposed to be a backup. They got these connections and gear that the ABC had been using to film football games, and a football game lasts an hour or so these things are only designed to last about an hour or so, but they're up right in this high country and they're supposed to be up for a couple of weeks, and so they had to innovate in all sorts of ways to try and keep the connections dry and working and so forth. It tested them.
Sorry if I missed something. When you said you saw the dish and you thought wrong place, wrong time, most of us wouldn't have known that. How did you know? You've been studying that all your life.
Well, I knew Reid, and I dated his daughter for 3 years, and I knew him quite well. He's a bit snippy with me. He didn't speak about it much, but I saw. I'll read it to you. I'll read you this. This is the thing I saw. If I can find it.
Robert Day talked about it. He was pretty shitty about it too.
This is an achievement award that was in his living room. It's dated the 20th of October 1969, which is 3 months to the day, American time, after Armstrong had stepped onto the moon. Addressed to Thomas Reid, Manned Space Flight Station Director, the award read in part for exceptional support to the success of the Apollo program. His leadership, professional skill and personal dedication to the management and operation of the manned space flight network contributed significantly to the Apollo missions and greatly advanced man's capabilities to explore the vastness of extraterrestrial space. So we're talking here, at this time we're talking about Apollo 8, Apollo 10 and Apollo 11. 9 was an orbital mission to test out the lunar module. 7 was orbital just to test the Saturn V rocket. And 1, of course, tragically blew up on a...
Just the firefighting gear.
Yeah. So that was the thing that was in my mind. So I go and watch the dish, and I'm sitting there thinking, you have to listen really, really hard for any mention whatever of Honeysuckle Creek. And there's one little mention, I think, if you listen really hard. Otherwise, you would not know. You would not know. And I think it was represented in the film that the Parkes dish transmitted signals. It couldn't transmit anything. It didn't have a transmitter. It doesn't have a
How'd
transmitter.
they get away with it?
Pardon?
I mean, like, obviously there's some people out there that would have known that.
Well, the really disappointing thing was that Mike Dinn and Tom Reid refused to be involved in it. Mike Dinn and John Saxon were actually consultants on the film, and they tried to make these points, but anyway, they weren't listened to.
Well, they couldn't film it anyway because the dish had been moved from Honeysuckle.
And that's the other thing, that
Yeah.
the
So
thing
what
about
was
the Parks dish is that it was there. And to be fair to Parks, I mean, they did receive most of the TV and they did do a good job. So you couldn't say that they weren't involved. They were involved to a significant degree.
But they needed the other dishes to tell them where to look, because they've got such a fine angle, they can't actually track anyway.
That's
They need to
correct.
know where to look.
And within Australia, the dishes were networked up. So Honeysuckle was networked with Tidbinbilla and it was networked with Parks. And but Honeysuckle had all the gear in it to be the main Apollo tracking station. So what would happen is, I think Tidbinbilla was linked to Honeysuckle. It's only a short distance. I think it was a microwave link. But the stuff coming in from Tidbinbilla would go through the special computers in Honeysuckle's operations control area. The signals coming in had to be packaged to go on to Houston, and the signals going up to the moon had to be all set up to go up to the moon once they'd come in from Houston, and the station that did that was Honeysuckle, set up for that purpose. That's what Brian Sullivan did. Amazingly, they had, this doesn't mean much to me, it means something to you guys, they had two 32 kb computers to do it. They had a 32 kb computer to do the uplink and a 32 kb computer to do the downlink, and they were the size of that sort of Radio Shack room there, or bigger, with great big, like...
Much bigger than was actually on the Apollo, though.
So, and that's the other thing, the Apollo spacecraft, of course, especially the lunar module, because of space constraints, it only had the tiniest little computer, and so whilst people all over the place, you guys probably could have picked up some of the downlink stuff with the right gear. The Soviet Union certainly could. The uplink was encrypted, but also they had a very strict protocol that only one space tracking station at a time would ever send an uplink to the lunar module. Otherwise, they'd fry the computer. So their most delicately choreographed sort of procedure was swapping the uplink, and it was quite a business to do it.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I've got a question. Andrew, I want you to take off your author's hat and put on your politician's hat for a minute.
I haven't done that for a while.
Well,
Not very keen to
but
do it these days.
you've got more experience than most of us here. It was such a period of time when Kennedy said we'll put a man on the moon, and we got to this point where basically the focus was on that and the world achieved it. In this day and age, we've got Brexit, we've got Trump in the White House, we've got all this Afghanistan, the stuff going on. Are we ever going to get back to that? That's question number one.
Well,
that's a hard question. I'll give you question number two, which is an easier one. Are the books for sale and how much are they?
No, well, wait a minute. It's a really interesting point you make, and like the story that people end up with is usually a bit different to the story where it begins. So everybody remembers President Kennedy making his promise to put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. It actually happened before Congress in May 1961. He made another quite famous speech a few months later, I think it was Rice University, which in some ways is a better known speech. But anyway, so everybody just assumed that he was always a great supporter of exploration in space. Well, he wasn't. The guy who was the big supporter was Lyndon Johnson. Johnson, as a senator, had actually been involved in setting NASA up. He was one of the great champions of NASA. But I'll just read you this. Kennedy came in January 1961. I think Gagarin went up literally within weeks of Kennedy's inauguration. And then Kennedy adopts Eisenhower's plan to back some people who are trying to invade Cuba, right? Which ends in a catastrophe. So Kennedy's sort of getting a bit panicky, and he calls in his experts pretty early in the piece after Gagarin's flight. So I just read this bit to you. In the 11 weeks between his inauguration and Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight, so this is before Gagarin goes up, President Kennedy had expressed serious doubts about the cost of sending a man to the moon. Can't you find me something to do here on Earth that would use the money more effectively? He asked his science advisor. But on hearing Gagarin's triumph, a rattled president interrogated the advisor again. This is a direct quote. Is there any place we can catch them? What can we do? Can we go around the moon before them? Can we leapfrog? When we know more, I can decide if it's worth it or not. If somebody can just tell me how to catch up. I don't care if it's the janitor over there if he knows how. The cost, that's what gets me. $30 billion and we don't even know if the damn thing will work. So that's, you know, and then of course...
$1 billion is worth something too.
Yeah. So then he summons up Lyndon Johnson and says to Johnson, do we have a chance of beating the Soviets by putting a laboratory in space, or by a trip around the moon, or by a rocket to go to the moon and back with a man? Is there any other space program which promises dramatic results in which we could win? And so he asked Johnson this, and Johnson, having been involved in space from the earliest days, knows exactly who to consult, and that's a former SS officer by the name of Werner von Braun. And Werner von Braun says, we do not have a good chance of beating the Soviets to a manned laboratory in space, but we have an excellent chance of beating them to the first landing of a crew on the moon.
Wow.
So that's von Braun. They had a bit of trouble with von Braun. Well, not trouble with him, but they... there was a decision taken not to use his Redstone rockets in the very first missions, with some unfortunate results. There was some rocket that blew up after getting up about 10 or 15 feet, and there was this reference to sort of Sputnik. So there was Sputnik, and what happened was that when this rocket fell down in a fireball, the little satellite popped off the top and started transmitting in some nearby bushes. And so there was Sputnik, and this thing was called Kaputnik. and so, it's true. There's a chapter in here, Sputnik and Kaputnik, Kaputnik. Thank you.
Yes.
But so it was only after that they, because they were worried about the PR side of von Braun. He had been a member of the SS, you know, and he developed the V2 rocket. And then the decision was taken. Well, stuff this, like we're going to von Braun, and the rest is history. I mean, von Braun's sort of role is incredible, and the Saturn V rocket. You guys know better than me. I haven't tried to compare it with anything now, but I still have a little bit of money that is probably still the most powerful thing that has ever been built. It's just the most extraordinary thing, and that was von Braun. And the Russians never mastered that. You see, they never. And this is going back to what I said at the beginning about how they were able to take risks initially and do cut corners. And the Americans sort of realised just like it's one thing to get a guy into orbit. It's an altogether different thing to get somebody on the moon and get them back, and that's where the Americans got ahead with this incredible complexity, because they were they just had a bigger pyramid. The base.
We've seen all the advantages. You talked to some of the advantages of that, but the question is, will we ever get back there again?
Well, you guys would know more about it than me, but I do try to follow it a little bit. And it seems to me that if anybody's serious about going to Mars, now Trump and Obama have both talked airily about it, but as far as I'm concerned, they can say what they like. Until there's some serious money thrown at it, nothing's going to happen. But there seems to be a strong argument that if somebody really seriously wants to go to Mars, the first step is to go back to the moon.
Well, NASA announced that yesterday.
Did they?
Yes.
Okay. I still don't think, good luck to them getting the money. You know what might
They
make
won't beat the Chinese.
Yeah,
Well, that's
that's the point.
That's
Well, it might
the
be
key.
Chinese.
That is actually the key point. The one way this race, or the one way somebody's going to get to Mars, and it's really going to arc up, is if the Chinese look like they're going to get there, and then all of a sudden you've got a recreation of the
Space race.
motivation that got people to the moon in the first place. So it's you need to, for all that's involved, you need, I think, sort of great power rivalry, and then you've got the right conditions, and you've probably got the right conditions for Congress to stump up the money.
Yeah, but what would you do when you got there?
Yeah,
Pardon me?
exactly.
Fix global warming.
What would you do that you can't do with a machine? Send it
Right.
right. Don't send it person.
Yeah.
Well,
That's
so
a,
anything, but then if we get, what I'm saying is if we get to the point where we've got the same vision, and what you're saying is correct, we think we've got to have the rivalry to make it happen.
I just told the story about a little dish that could. I'm not into the geopolitics of whether we should go anywhere else. Anyway, anybody wants a book
I
on
think
it?
Second question.
another question is,
The second
Mars
question, how much?
landing gonna be done in a Hollywood studio too?